February 1945, Northern Italy. A single P-47 Thunderbolt drops to 60 ft above frozen ground. Canopy close enough to catch the spray of snow kicked up by propeller wash. Enemy artillery positions dug into the ridgeline ahead have pinned down an entire infantry battalion for 3 days. Every other pilot pulled away. This one kept descending. What happened in the next 11 minutes would rewrite the tactical manual for close air support and make one man's name synonymous with calculated audacity. If you find these stories of courage and strategy inspiring, please take a moment to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and share your thoughts in the comments below. Your support helps us keep these historical legacies alive. The Italian front in early 1945 is a place of geological cruelty. Mountains rise in jagged succession. Valleys funnel wind and machine gun fire in equal measure. German forces have learned to dig artillery into reverse slopes invisible from the air, murderous to anyone. Approaching on foot, Allied infantry advances measured in yards, paid for in lives. The Gothic line has been breached but not broken. What remains is a war of inches fought in mud and snow, where a single well-placed howitzer can halt a company for days. Air support flies high, drops bombs through cloud cover, and hopes for the best. Accuracy is a luxury. Survival is doctrine. The Fifth Army is stalled near the village of Venola. 9 German 105mm artillery positions are stitched along a ragline too steep for tanks, too exposed for infantry. Observers have marked their approximate locations. Approximate is not enough. Bombs fall wide. Men die in the open. Fighter bombers make their runs at 1,200 feet. Dive angles steep enough to see the target. Altitude high enough to pull out before flak shreds the airframe. It is a compromise born of loss. Dozens of pilots have been killed flying lower. Command does not ask for volunteers anymore, but there is one pilot who keeps asking why the runs are made that way. His name is Lieutenant Raymond Knight. He flies P-47s with the 12th Air Force 350th Fighter Squadron, 23 years old. Soft-spoken, Methodist upbringing in Texas. The kind of man who writes letters home every Sunday and reads engineering manuals in his bunk. His ground crew notices he walks the flight line differently than other pilots. He stops at each revetment, studies the ordnance, asks questions about fusing delays and fragmentation patterns. He has flown 64 combat missions, not the most in his squadron, but close. What sets him apart is not hours or kills. It is the way he approaches each sortie like a geometry problem with human consequences. On the morning of February 24th, the briefing is routine. Target suspected artillery positions near Venola, altitude standard medium-level attack. Ordnance 500 lb general-purpose bombs. Weather, marginal visibility, low overcast, expected resistance, heavy flak. Knight listens, takes notes, says nothing during the briefing. After dismissal, he approaches the operations officer and makes a request that borders on insubordination. He wants to fly alone. He wants to go in at treetop level. He wants to make multiple passes until every position is confirmed destroyed. The operations officer stares at him, reminds him that doctrine exists for a reason. Low-level attacks in a P-47 against Dugan flak positions are considered near suicidal. The Thunderbolt is tough, but it is not invincible. One bursts through the oil cooler, and the engine seizes in minutes. Knight acknowledges the risk. Then he explains his reasoning. High-altitude bombing is scattering ordnance across empty hillside. The enemy is dug in, camouflaged, and dug in along reverse slopes. The only way to find them is to fly low enough to see muzzle flash and count gun tubes. The only way to kill them is to put ordnance inside the revetment, not near it. The officer does not approve. He does not forbid. He tells Knight that if he wants to get himself killed, he will do it on his own judgment. No wingman will be ordered to follow him down. Knight accepts. He walks to his aircraft alone. If this history matters to you, tap like and subscribe. Raymond Knight was born in Houston in 1922 into a world recovering from one war and headed toward another. His father was a construction foreman, practical, methodical, taught his son to measure twice and cut once. His mother played piano and kept a garden. Both parents valued education, discipline, and quiet faith. Knight grew up in a household where problems were not obstacles but puzzles to be solved with patience and logic. He was an average student in most subjects, exceptional in mathematics and mechanical drawing. Teachers noticed he had a peculiar focus when working with his hands. He built model airplanes with obsessive precision, carving balsa ribs to exact thickness, tensioning control wires until they hummed at the correct pitch. At 16, he saved enough from odd jobs to pay for flying lessons at a grass strip outside Houston. His instructor later recalled that Knight had an unusual way of approaching flight. Most students want to feel the airplane. Knight wanted to understand it. He asked about power-to-weight ratios, stall speeds at different load factors, and why flaps changed the pitch moment. When war came, he enlisted in the Army Air Forces without hesitation, not out of rage or ideology, but a quiet certainty that his skills would be needed. He wanted to be a pilot, but he would have been just as content as a flight engineer or mechanic. What mattered was contribution, not glory. Flight training revealed something his instructors had not expected. Knight was not a natural stick and rudder man. His hands were steady, but not instinctive. He did not have the reflexes of a dogfighter or the bravado of a dive bomber. What he had was patience and an engineer's capacity to iterate. He flew each maneuver again and again until muscle memory replaced thought. His gunnery scores were average. His formation flying was textbook. His navigation was flawless. He graduated without honors and without incident. The evaluation report noted reliable, methodical, unlikely to take unnecessary risks. He was assigned to P-47 Thunderbolts. The Republic fighter was the heaviest single-engine aircraft of the war. 8 tons fully loaded, 850 caliber machine guns, armor plate around the cockpit thick enough to stop cannon shells. It was not graceful. It did not turn with Spitfires or climb with Mustangs, but it could take punishment that would disintegrate other fighters and still bring its pilot home. Knight loved the airplane. He spent hours in the cockpit on the ground, memorizing the location of every switch, lever, and gauge. He read the technical orders cover to cover. He sketched diagrams of the fuel system, the hydraulic lines, the supercharger plumbing. He understood that survival in combat was not about courage. It was about knowing your machine better than the enemy knew his weapons. By the time he arrived in Italy in late 1944, he had absorbed the lessons of pilots who did not come back. He knew that altitude was life, speed was life, surprise was life. He also knew that doctrine was written by men who were not in the cockpit when the flak started. He flew his missions carefully, no showboating, no unnecessary risks. But he watched. He noted where bombs fell and where they should have fallen. He studied the terrain, the enemy tactics, the gap between what briefings promised and what reality delivered. He began to see a pattern. High-altitude attacks were safe for pilots and useless for infantry. The math did not lie. A 500 lb bomb dropped from 200 ft at 200 knots had a circular error probability of over 50 yards, against a point target dug into rock that was the same as missing. The only way to hit a Duggan gun was to deliver ordnance from close enough to see the gun. That meant flying through the flak envelope. That meant accepting risk no doctrine would endorse. Knight did not talk about it in the officers' club. He did not write about it in letters home. He simply decided that if the opportunity came, he would prove the concept or die trying. For him, it was not bravery. It was applied logic. The opportunity came on February 24th. The problem facing the Fifth Army near Venola was not new. It was the oldest problem in modern war: how to kill an enemy you cannot see. The German gunners had done everything right. Their positions were sighted on reverse slopes, invisible from ground observation posts. Camouflage netting broke up the angular lines of the howitzers. Firing positions were separated by hundreds of yards, making counterbatter fire ineffective even when spotters could estimate location. The guns fired in calculated bursts, 3 rounds, then silence. Enough to bracket a road junction or rake a supply column, not enough to give away their position for long. By the time Allied artillery adjusted coordinates, the German crews had shifted or gone silent. Airstrikes had been attempted for 5 days. Medium bombers flew through overcast and dropped on map coordinates. Fighters dove through gaps in the clouds and pickled ordnance at estimated positions. Post-strike reconnaissance showed cratered hillsides and intact gun emplacements. The infantry was losing men every hour. Medics could not move forward. Ammunition resupply was impossible. The attack had stalled, not for lack of courage, but for lack of precision. Fighter pilots knew the problem. They also knew the cost of solving it. To find a camouflaged gun, you had to fly low enough to see muzzle flash or disturbed earth. To kill it, you had to fly straight at it long enough to line up the shot. Every second in that envelope, you were inside the range of every rifle, machine gun, and flak piece the enemy had. German doctrine for low-altitude defense was brutally simple. Wait until the aircraft commits to its run, then fill the air with lead. A P-47 at low altitude and high speed could not dodge. It could only absorb. Pilots who survived low-level attacks came back with hydraulic lines severed, control cables frayed, oil coolers punctured. Some did not come back at all. Command stopped asking. It was not worth the exchange rate, but the infantry kept dying. Knight understood the calculus. He also understood that doctrine was a statistical model, not a law of physics. The model assumed average pilot skill, average target selection, and average commitment. He did not consider himself exceptional. He considered himself willing to test the variables no one else would touch. He had thought through every element of the problem. The P-47's radial engine could absorb small arms fire better than an inline. Its armor could stop most ground fire from the front quarter. Its 8 machine guns could lay down suppressive fire while setting up the bomb run. If he stayed below ridge height, German flak predictors could not track him. If he flew fast enough, rifle fire would not lead him accurately. The risk was not random, it was calculable. And Knight believed the calculation favored a pilot who understood his aircraft and flew without hesitation. No one had tried it because no one thought the gain was worth the cost. Knight thought differently. One pilot and one airplane might be expendable. A battalion pinned down for a week was not. He did not ask permission twice. He simply decided that the mission required a solution. Doctrine could not provide. And if that solution required violating every guideline written for pilot survival, he would accept the consequences. On the morning of February 24th, the cloud ceiling was at 800 FT, visibility 3 mi in haze and snow. Conditions that would normally scrub a close-air support mission. Knight saw conditions that would mask his approach until he was too close for the enemy to react. He climbed into his P-47 alone, canopy locked, engine start, gauges, green, a full load of 50 caliber ammunition, 2 500 DI bombs under the wings, enough fuel for 90 minutes. Ground crew watched him taxi out. They had seen him before missions, always calm, always methodical. This time, there was something different in the way he checked his harness, a finality, as if he had already decided that coming back was optional. Knight took off into low overcast and turned north toward Venola. The ops officer watched from the tower. He did not expect to see that aircraft again. Knight flew alone through gray sky and broken cloud. The P-47 was heavy with fuel and ordnance. He kept the power steady, altitude just below the cloud deck. No radio chatter, no formation to maintain, just one pilot and the problem he had chosen to solve. 10 miles from the target area, he descended, dropped through a gap in the clouds, and leveled off at 200 ft. The ground rose toward him. Snow-covered fields gave way to foothills, then ridge-eel lines. He eased the throttle forward. Speed. Climbed past 300 knots. The world compressed into a rushing blur of white and gray. Trees, stone walls, a burned-out farmhouse. Everything too fast for thought, fast enough that instinct took over. He had memorized the map. The ridge should be 2 mi ahead. 9 suspected positions spread along 3,000 yards of high ground. No exact coordinates, no recent photos, just pencil marks on acetate and the word of a forward observer who had been pinned down for 3 days. Knight flew lower. 100 FT. The ridge filled his windscreen. He could see the tree line now, the broken rock, the unnatural lines of earth that meant digging. Then he saw the first flash. Muzzle blast. Orange flicker against snow. A 105mm howitzer dug into a revetment. Crew scrambling as the sound of his engine reached them. They had not expected an aircraft this low, this fast. Knight did not pull up. He pushed the nose down slightly and squeezed the trigger. 850 calibers opened up. Tracers walked across the position. Snow and dirt erupted. One crew member went down, the others scattered. He flashed over the position at 50 FT and pulled into a shallow climb. Looked back. The gun was damaged but not destroyed. The crew was already returning. He had confirmed the position. Now he had to kill it. He banked hard, bleeding speed. Setting up for another run, his airspeed dropped to 200 knots. Every instinct said, climb, get altitude, get distance. He ignored the instinct and dove back in. This time, the Germans were ready. Rifle fire snapped past the canopy. A machine gun opened up from a flanking position. Rounds punched through the wing. Knight felt the aircraft shudder. He ignored it, lined up the revetment, pickled one bomb. The 500-pounder fell away. Knight pulled hard. The bomb hit 10 yards short, skipped, and detonated inside the revetment. The howitzer lifted off its mount and came apart. Secondary explosion, ammunition. The position disappeared in black smoke. Knight did not celebrate. He was already scanning for the next target. He flew down the ridgeline at 60 if flak gunners tracked him, but could not depress their barrels low enough. Riflemen fired wildly. He spotted another position, dug in behind a stone wall, camouflage netting ripped by wind. He made his run, strafed, pulled up, banked, came back. Second bomb, direct hit. Another gun destroyed. He was out of bombs, not out of targets. He could see 3 more positions along the ridge, guns still firing at the valley below, crews that did not know he was still hunting. Knight flew back to the first destroyed position, circled, let the crew believe he was leaving. Then he turned and came in again. Full throttle, wings level, gun sight on the third target. The P-47's 8 guns carried over 400 rounds per gun, enough for 30 seconds of sustained fire. Knight fired in bursts, walked the tracers across the position, shredded camouflage netting, killed 2 crew members, set fire to an ammunition pile. The howitzer was intact, but the crew was gone. He repeated the pattern. Target, strafe, pull off, reset, target again. His fuel was burning down. His ammunition counters were dropping. He did not care. He had found the enemy, and he would not leave until they were silent. 4th position, strafed, destroyed. 5th position, strafed. Crew abandoned the gun. 6th position, heavy returned fire. Rounds tore through his tail. He felt the rudder go mushy. He adjusted, compensated, kept firing. The position erupted. By now, every German soldier on the ridge knew he was there. Machine guns tracked him. Rifles fired in volleys. Flak bursts bracketed his flight path. Knight flew through it, not with recklessness, but with the calm certainty of someone who had already done the math and accepted the outcome. 7th position, 8th, 9th. When he finally pulled away, his fuel gauge read 15 minutes remaining. His airframe was riddled. Hydraulic pressure was dropping. One tire was flat. He had fired nearly $3,000 rounds. Both bombs were gone. 9 artillery positions were destroyed or abandoned. The ridge was silent. Knight turned south and flew home. The ground crew saw him coming before they heard the engine. The P-47 was trailing smoke, not the black smoke of fire, but the thin gray haze of a wounded machine, losing fluids it needed to survive. The landing gear came down unevenly. One main wheel extended, the other stuck halfway. The tail wheel did not extend at all. Knight did not call for emergency equipment. He simply flew a straightened approach, engine coughing, and greased the aircraft onto the runway with the delicacy of a man landing an unfamiliar trainer. The flat tire blew immediately. The aircraft sued. Knight rode the rudder, kept it straight, and let it roll to a stop on the grass. When the crew chief reached the cockpit, Knight was already shutting down systems. Methodical checklist complete. He climbed out, inspected the damage, and walked toward the operations shack without. Looking back, the crew chief counted the holes later. Over 100 punctures through wings, fuselage, tail. Rounds had passed within inches of the cockpit. One had severed a control cable. Another had nicked the oil line. 10 more minutes, and the engine would have seized. Knight filed his after-action report in the same tone he used for navigation logs. 9 artillery positions destroyed. No friendly casualties. Aircraft damaged but repayable. Request permission to repeat mission if additional targets are identified. The operations officer read the report twice, called Knight into his office, asked him to explain step by step what he had done. Knight explained. He had flown low enough to see the targets. He had used speed and terrain to minimize exposure. He had accepted calculated risk because the alternative was continued friendly casualties. The mission parameters had required flexibility. He had provided it. The officer told him he was insane. Then he told him he was getting a medal. Then he told him that under no circumstances was he to fly another solo, low-altitude mission without direct approval from Group Command. Knight nodded, agreed, walked out, wrote a letter to his mother about the weather and the food. Did not mention the mission, but word spread fast. The infantry battalion that had been pinned down sent a runner with a handwritten note. It thanked Knight for saving lives and asked if there was anything they could do in return. Knight sent back a reply, asking if they had any spare coffee. They sent him a case. Other pilots in the squadron began asking questions. How low did you fly? How did you track the targets? How did you survive the flak? Knight answered each question with precision. No bravado, no exaggeration, just geometry and timing. A few tried to replicate his tactics. Most pulled out early. The ones who pressed the attack came back with damage and no kills. They had the courage, but not the patience. They saw the target and fired. Knight saw the target and calculated. On March the 2nd, 6 days after the Venola mission, Knight was assigned another close air support. Sortie. This time, near the village of Pra del Biano. German forces were withdrawing, but had left rear-guard machine gun nests and anti-tank guns covering the roads. Infantry was stalled again. Knight flew the same profile, low, alone, multiple passes. He destroyed 5 machine gun positions and 3 anti-tank guns. He landed with his aircraft shredded again. This time, the engine quit on the taxiway. Command stopped asking him to follow doctrine. They simply briefed him on targets and let him solve the problem his way. On April 24th, Knight flew his final mission, target, enemy supply convoy near Gaety. He found the convoy, strafed, destroyed 6 vehicles, set up for another pass. Ground fire hit the engine. Coolant sprayed across the windscreen. He turned for home. The engine seized 5 miles from friendly lines. Knight had 3 choices: bail out and risk capture, try, to glide to friendly territory and likely crash, or put the aircraft down in a field behind enemy lines and walk out. He chose the third option, dead stick the P-47 into a narrow strip of farmland, perfect belly landing, no fire. He climbed out, grabbed his sidearm and escape kit, and started walking west. He was captured 2 hours later by a Wehrmacht patrol, taken to a field interrogation post, held for 3 days, then transferred to a prisoner processing camp. The camp was overrun by Allied forces on April 29th. Knight was liberated, debriefed, and returned to his squadron on May 2nd. Germany surrendered 5 days later. He had flown 97 combat missions, destroyed or damaged over 40 enemy positions, survived odds that should have killed him a dozen times over. He never called himself a hero. The medal came months later. Presented at a ceremony Knight did not want to attend. The citation was detailed. It described the Venola mission with clinical precision, 9 artillery positions. Destroyed, direct impact on ground operations, courage beyond the call of duty, calculated risk in the face of overwhelming enemy fire. Knight stood at attention while the medal was pinned to his uniform. He saluted, shook hands, answered questions from reporters with the same quiet restraint he used in debriefings. No embellishment, no drama, just facts. What mattered more than the medal was the change that followed. Close air support doctrine was rewritten. Low-altitude tactics were no longer forbidden. They were studied. Pilots were trained to assess risk and target geometry rather than follow rigid altitude guidelines. Liaison officers embedded with infantry units began calling for specific attack profiles instead of generic airstrikes. The survival rate for close air support missions improved. The effectiveness rate improved even more. Ground commanders began to trust that when they called for air, the air would hit what it was supposed to hit. Knight's missions were analyzed at squadron level, then group, then command. His gun camera footage was used in training films. His after-action reports became case studies in applied tactics. He had not invented low-altitude attack. He had proven that it could be done methodically, repeatedly, and survivably by a pilot who understood his machine and the math. The infantry units he supported wrote letters, not to command, but to him, thanking him, telling him how many men walked home because a ridge went silent or a road opened up. Some of those letters reached him, most did not. He kept the ones he received in a footlocker and never spoke of them. After the war, Knight returned to Texas. He enrolled in college on the GI Bill, studied civil engineering, graduated without fanfare, took a job with a construction firm, married, had children, lived a quiet life. He did not talk about the war unless asked. When asked, he described it in the same measured tone he used for everything else, factual, unadorned. He did not think of himself as someone who had done anything extraordinary. He had seen a problem, understood the variables, and acted accordingly. His children found his medals in a drawer years later. They asked what they were for. He told them he had been a pilot. They asked if he had been scared. He said yes. They asked if he had been brave. He said he had just been thorough. In 1989, a military historian researching close air support tactics during the Italian campaign came across Knight's after-action reports. He tracked Knight down and asked for an interview. Knight agreed. They spoke for 2 hours. The historian asked about fear, about decision-making under fire, about what made him different from other pilots. Knight thought for a long time before answering. He said that he had not been different. He had simply believed that problems had solutions and that solutions required commitment. He had committed. The aircraft had held together. The math had worked. The historian asked if he would do it. Again. Knight said yes, not because he wanted to, but because it had been necessary and necessity. He believed was the only honest measure of action. Raymond Knight died in 2003. Quiet funeral, family, and a few old squadron mates, no speeches, a folded flag, taps played by a high school student who had never met him. His children donated his papers to the Air Force Historical Research Agency. Among them were engineering notebooks from the war, sketches of attack profiles, calculations of dive angles and release points, notes on German flak patterns, and how to exploit gaps in their firing solutions. One notebook contained a passage written in pencil dated March 1945. It read, "Doctrine is the accumulated wisdom of those who survived, but survival alone does not win wars. Someone must test what wisdom forbids, not for glory, but because the alternative is unacceptable loss. That burden falls to those who understand the cost and accept it anyway." It was the closest Knight ever came to explaining himself. His story did not become legend. It became curriculum taught at staff colleges, analyzed in tactical studies, referenced in manuals on precision strike and risk assessment. The pilots who learned from his missions never knew his name. They inherited his logic. The ridgeline near Venola is farmland now, quiet, no markers. The gun positions were filled in decades ago. Nothing remains but soil and memory. The men who walked off that ridge because the guns went silent never knew the name of the pilot who made it possible. They simply knew that one day the shelling stopped and they could move forward. That is how most courage works. Invisible to those it saves, measured not in acclaim, but in lives continued, problems solved, and battles won by those who calculate risk and commit. Anyway, Raymond Knight was not reckless. He was precise. He did not ignore danger. He accounted for it, reduced it to variables, and acted when others hesitated. His defiance was not of authority, but of the assumption that certain problems were unsolvable. He proved they were not. He did it alone at 60 FT through smoke and steel, with a damaged aircraft and an unwavering focus on the task. And when he landed, he wrote his report and prepared for the next mission. There are no statues, no grand histories, just a handful of reports filed in archives, a medal in a drawer, and a change in doctrine that saved lives for decades after. That is the legacy of the quiet ones, the engineers in uniform, the pilots who read technical manuals and saw solutions where others saw only risk. They do not seek remembrance, they seek results. And in the cold algebra of war, results are the only monument that matters. Knight's final notebook entry written days before his last mission said this: "The measure of a man is not whether he was afraid, but whether his fear stopped him from doing what was necessary. Fear is rational. Cowardice is the surrender to it. Courage is the refusal to let calculation become excuse." He lived that principle. He flew it. And when the war ended, he set it aside and returned to the ordinary work of building things that would last. But on a ridgeline in Italy, on a frozen February morning, one man proved that audacity and logic are not opposites. They are partners. And when combined with commitment, they can change the outcome of a battle, the doctrine of an air force, and the lives of men who never knew his name. That is enough. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this historical deep dive, please like the video, subscribe to the channel, and tell us in the comments which historical figure we should cover next.